We have such news coming from the Crimean Peninsula that there are trucks that belong to a certain department of the Russian troops, and this department is responsible for the handling of nuclear weapons.
Приналежні до певного управління російських військ, і відповідає це управління саме за поводження із ядерним озброєнням.
Or is this, in fact, done, let's say, intentionally on the part of Putin in order to scare everyone around? We know that Putin likes to play with this topic and throw it into the information space. Is the deployment of nuclear weapons already taking place on the territory of Ukraine, temporarily occupied, in Crimea? What could this mean? What threats can this pose not only to us, obviously? In my opinion, we must understand that Putin, together with his assistants, when forming a military platform, first of all drew up a strategy that influenced the leadership of our allies. In Ukraine, this is also felt, but it does not quite affect our partners and leadership. In fact, two areas are affected: nuclear weapons and everything related to them, and escalation.
Фактично ефективними двома напрямками, тобто ядерна зброя, і навколо нього все це, і друге це ескалація.
And that is why they have a document, a program, where this kind of action takes place with the appropriate frequency.
З відповідною періодичністю відбуваються такого роду дії.
As for the nuclear threat, once every 2 weeks or several times a month, they add pressure on the issue of escalation. This can happen more often, once a week or 10 days. And Putin analyzes this, intelligence reports to him, in particular, about the influence on the leadership of each country, what fears each politician has, and so on. That is, they work quite carefully on each candidate. They are convinced that it is effective. Well, the classic attitude towards Merkel being afraid of the dog, and how he used that attitude, and anything else. And that's why it continues, we see it. The situation is not easy now. New approaches are being sought on the part of the Russians to be effective, and the nuclear direction has always been key in this. Crimea, back in Soviet times, had a storage facility for nuclear weapons. When it was captured, appropriate repairs were carried out, it was secured, and so on. Indeed, 12 departments take care of this. Work has been carried out. Well, in general, before the war, they tried to show in one way or another that this possible weapon was appearing in the Black Sea Fleet, and so on. Before the war, I served in the Odessa Air Defense Corps. Crimea was subordinate to us and participated in the control of repairs, in particular of the Moskva cruiser. It had nuclear weapons, and we were trying to find out if it was really on board or not. Training was conducted, targets were shot down, and so on. That is, these trends have their own background from those times. Now, of course, it is necessary to increase the degree of tension. We see that in recent years, aid, despite all the slogans from the Americans, has been weakening. The presidential race has an impact on this situation and on aid. Therefore, he is analyzing how to increase his efforts in terms of pressure and neutralize events, such as hostilities in the Kursk direction.
Ситуація у нас на фронті, тобто він аналізує, щоб десь наростити свої зусилля з точки зору тиску і нівелювати якісь події типу Курської бойових дій на Курському напряму.
Therefore, it is logical to implement such a strategy, and it must be borne in mind that this will continue. In addition, as an example of the events surrounding nuclear weapons in Belarus, Lukashenko's statements that he will use these weapons look groundless, because he will not be allowed to use these weapons. So far, all this is Russian. But this is a kind of game in order to implement this strategy of pressure on Western countries. That is, the events that may unfold in Crimea in connection with the transfer of nuclear facilities of the Russian triad, as they call it, to what extent they, let's say, resemble what happened in Belarus, that is, a bluff, in fact, a nuclear bluff. After all, Lukashenko was not given control over these weapons, and we have no reliable evidence that any nuclear weapons carriers or elements of the Russian nuclear infrastructure were really moved to Belarus, and not just an eye of blurring and intimidation of the whole world.
Ядерного озброєння справді Білорусь були переміщені, а не відбулося, що називається, окозамилювання взагалі всього світу, так і залякування.
As for Crimea, the situation there is different. It has been directly controlled by Russia since its annexation in 2014. And at the same time, this is the Black Sea region, where NATO countries are located: Bulgaria, Romania, Turkey. Let's not forget that Turkey is also a member of the alliance, despite the different relations with Russia and Moscow on the part of the Erdogan government and his team. But is this threat of the transfer of nuclear weapons higher in the case of Crimea than in the case of Belarus, if we compare these two cases? Is it possible to believe that Putin will take this step in order to, again, raise the stakes, as they say, as it is understood in Moscow? The capabilities of Belarus and Crimea are being used, and he will continue to do so. There are differences. As for Belarus, it is the carriers, the Belarusian carriers, that are being prepared in order to demonstrate the possibility of transferring nuclear weapons. These are Su-24s, which can carry missiles or bombs with nuclear weapons, as well as Iskander batteries, which may have been modified. But this does not mean that nuclear weapons have actually been transferred. This is happening. They are also building a storage facility in Belarus with requirements for nuclear weapons. As a regimental commander, brigade commanders had missiles with nuclear warheads. These have been requirements since Soviet times, but over time, these requirements have decreased, including control and priority. We remember how they did nuclear weapons exercises every month and tried to make something extraordinary out of it, as something outstanding. In fact, maintenance, control, inspection and other relevant activities are carried out on a monthly basis. And that's why in Belarus there is a minimum of carriers, but they show that there is progress there. In fact, no one passed anything there. The question of why Americans feel this way about this is an open question. As for Crimea, the situation is similar. They use this approach to escalate by showing the possibility of nuclear weapons appearing here and there. This also includes attempts to prohibit Ukraine from taking certain actions, which creates red lines for us. Thus, they put pressure on our allies, first of all on the Americans. And that's why now we need to pay attention to Crimea, to their capabilities and the possibility of producing, as it were, including nuclear weapons. And this work on this side will continue. Both our intelligence and our strategic allies need to work with this. Another topic related to Russian strikes on Ukrainian territory with missiles, including ballistic missiles, became known in the information space only after analyzing the remains, elements and debris of the missile that fell on the Kyiv while repelling a massive combined attack on the night of the past day, September 2nd.
Among
the wreckage, in addition to ballistic missiles, Skanders and Kh-101 cruise missiles, fragments of an anti-aircraft guided missile launched from the S-400 Triumph complex were also found. Actually, so far various sources have been writing about this, let's say, the media. We have not yet seen an official comment from our Air Force on this topic, or from the General Staff. But there is information that one of the missiles is probably an anti-aircraft guided missile launched from the S-400 Triumph complex. And the question arises about the characteristics of this missile and the place of its launch, since it is known from open sources that its maximum range is up to 250 kilometers. The Russians use these anti-aircraft missiles, as we know, to terrorize the civilian population in our cities, both S-300 and S-400 systems. And potentially, they could launch such a missile from the Bryansk region, from the border of the Bryansk region. Given the tense situation in the border areas of the Bryansk region, the Russians themselves announced the activities of sabotage and reconnaissance groups and the constant shelling that is taking place there. Can we really assume that they brought their valuable Triumph 400 complex there in order to shoot, as they say, at Kyiv? Or, perhaps, it could have happened from the territory of Belarus. So far, again, I repeat, we do not have any official data on this topic regarding this incident. If we simulate a situation where the enemy could launch such an S-400 missile at Kyiv, what versions are emerging? Versions can be different, as you noted, both Belarusian and Bryansk. It must be said here that this is not the first time that the S-400 has been used since the Russian Federation. Such attempts and examples have already taken place. The Russians used the S-300, but it should be noted that they still have thousands of such missiles that were previously decommissioned but are now being restored. These missiles from Soviet times are now used mainly as surface-to-surface missiles. Their range and accuracy decrease with distance, so the S-400, which has better range and accuracy characteristics, is used for especially important purposes, such as Kyiv. If necessary, the S-400s are used because they are more difficult to shoot down, especially with limited response from air defense personnel. Although Russia has significantly more S-400s than S-500s, recent attempts to deploy the S-500 in Crimea to intercept United States missiles have failed. Thus, the S-400 is used for systemic influence on capitals, where air defense is the most powerful. The Russians are trying to find ways to break through this defense. If the S-400 missile was shot down, this indicates the achievement of our air defense and is a significant success.
Це відбувається комплекси таких, у них більше зовсім мало С-500, які вони це новий протиракетний комплекс, який вони намагалися розташовувати в Криму, щоб збивати ракети, значить, Сполучених Штатів. Невдало працюють С-300 і навіть С-400 по ним, і намагались застосувати, але ж не досягли ефективних результатів. Тому С-400 у них значно більше. І тому, якщо ставити за мету системно впливати на столицю, а до того ми знаємо, що протиповітряна, протиракетна оборона найбільш потужна в столиці у нас по Україні, тому вони шукають шляхи, як це долати, як пробивати цю протиракетну оборону. Ну і, до речі, фахівці саме тут відмічають, що якби була вперше збита саме, тобто вона уламки не підірвалась, тому що вона, ця ракета від С-400, а тому, що вона збита. І якщо збита, це досягнення, опять-таки, наших обслуг протиракетної, протиповітряної оборони.
The missile was indeed shot down. All air targets were shot down during the last attack on the night of September 2nd. The last attack. We hope it is the latter, but we understand that the war continues. And you can believe in the best, of course, but Russia continues this missile terror. So, the attack that took place yesterday, during this attack, all air targets were shot down and various types of missiles were neutralized, as well as ballistics and cruise missiles. And this missile, launched from the S-400 Triumph complex, was also neutralized, and the wreckage has now been analyzed. We found out that the missile, as they say, is special, which the Russians launched at the Ukrainian capital with the hope that it would still hit a target. But this is precisely the method of Russian terrorism, to use such missiles from anti-aircraft missile systems, which are not very accurate, but it is difficult to shoot him down. They are launched solely for the purpose of terrorizing the civilian population. We emphasize this once again. Another topic that has now surfaced in the Western media is also about missiles. And it concerns precisely the ballistics that it can transfer, the ballistic missiles that Iran can transfer. Some sources, including the Bloomberg news agency, report that Iran may transfer its ballistic missiles, such as Fateh and Zulfikar, as well as other similar systems, to Russia in the coming days. This article, which was published yesterday in Bloomberg, writes that Ukraine's allies expect Iran to deliver missiles to Russia soon. The volume and timing of such deliveries are not specifically discussed, but there are fears and reasons to believe that this may happen in the near future, perhaps even this week. Well, here's the information. Already there, they analyzed where these missiles could potentially fly, and so on. Well, in any case, this really strengthens the Russian ability to fire Ukraine both in number and distance. These missiles can even reach the western regions. There are different missiles of different ranges, and this is what analytics from the Western media looks like. The question is, why, despite all the attempts of the West to stop any contacts between Iran and Russia on this topic, as well as to put up barriers to the transfer of such missiles to Moscow by Tehran, there are still reports of a possible supply of missiles? Why, despite all the efforts of the Biden administration to control the escalation, do such allegations remain relevant? We are not allowed to use ATACMS to strike Russian territory, but we are still approaching the point where Russia can get Iranian ballistic missiles. In my opinion, this is a high-level game where the main players are the great powers, and it is related to nuclear danger, the possibility of pressure through the use of nuclear and missile weapons, as well as the ability to influence the situation through the conduct of appropriate negotiations.
Скажімо, небезпекою, можливістю тиску, використання взагалі ядерної зброї, ракетної зброї і от спроможності якби впливати на ситуацію шляхом ведення відповідних переговорів.
That is, we must understand that not all activities and games at a high level are open to the public. This is a dynamic process, where the manifestations of permits or prohibitions on the use of missile weapons, the situation with nuclear weapons, as well as the development of stages of escalation or their stop. At the moment, there is no stoppage, and control over the situation is carried out by the Americans, in particular in ideological areas, which is supervised by Mr. Sullivan.
Якогось етапу ескалації чи зупинення його немає, скажімо, а от того контроля, за якою тримаються американці, ідеолог, на мій погляд, їх пан Саліван.
And that's why these kinds of approaches, they are the results of work, including closed communication, respectively, no matter what anyone says. On the one hand, there is the position, not a word about Ukraine without Ukraine, but we are witnessing the visits of the same Sullivan to China and discussions that actually continue their work. The missile factor remains important, as does the nuclear one. Strategy games change, and there are routes for restrictions and possible lifting of bans, which are defined in certain terms.
І вони міняються, і відтіля теж є коріння того, на що є заборони, чи будуть зніматися і в які терміни.
Everything is connected here, and a large number of these activities remain closed for now. However, it is possible to make some judgments about this indirectly, and this is what we are trying to do. Actually, our warnings are not unfounded. We know that there has already been a transfer of ballistic missiles from Pyongyang to Moscow. These missiles have already been used, and there were earlier publications in the Western media that when North Korea transfers its ballistic missiles to Russia, the West may remove certain prohibitive barriers for Ukraine. It seemed that after that, we would definitely be allowed to use the ATACMS to strike Russian territory. But no, it didn't happen. Russia uses ballistics from North Korea. In Ukraine, it is forbidden to hit ATACMS on Russian territory. Perhaps now that there is a threat from Iran regarding the transfer of such missiles, the West will take a bolder step towards cooperation with Ukraine and lift these restrictions. But these are our hopes. We must continue to work in this direction and talk about it with our partners. Of course, we hope that the transfer of ballistic missiles from Tehran to Moscow will not happen, as this will significantly increase the ability of Putin, who is already agonizing, to inflict even greater blows on Ukraine. Whatever these Iranian weapons are, their appearance will only make the situation worse. This is still a serious threat to our cities and to the civilian population. I thank you for your inclusion, Mr. Ihor, for the conversation. This applies to a variety of threats. Ihor Romanenko, Lieutenant General and former Deputy Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, was in touch with us. They discussed the issue of nuclear weapons, which Putin is likely to transfer to Crimea, as well as other threats related to the missiles that Russia uses.